The biting winter wind of the Colorado Territory howled through the canyon like a wounded animal as Yates Montgomery pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders. It was 1874, and the approaching blizzard threatened to be the worst Silver Creek had seen in a decade. He shouldn't have stayed out checking fence lines so long, but stubbornness ran in his blood as surely as cattle ranching did. A flash of color against the white landscape caught his eye, something that didn't belong among the snow-laden pines. Yates tugged his horse's reins, steering the animal toward what appeared to be a bundle of fabric half buried in a snowdrift. As he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. She lay curled on her side, a shawl pulled tight around what he initially thought was a bundle of possessions. But then he heard a soft whimpering that wasn't coming from the woman. Dismounting in haste, Yates knelt beside her still form and gently turned her. There, clutched protectively against her chest, was a baby, red-faced and crying weakly. "Madam," Yates called, brushing snow from her pale face. Her skin was cold, but he could see the faint cloud of her breath. Relief flooded him. She was alive, but barely. The infant couldn't be more than a few months old, wrapped in layers that had kept it warmer than its mother, who appeared to have sacrificed her own comfort for her child. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. Confusion and fear crossed her features as she tried to pull away. "Easy now," Yates said, his voice gentle but urgent. "You're freezing out here. You and your little one need shelter." He glanced up at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming in hard. My ranch is just over that ridge." The woman clutched her baby tighter, her chapped lips parting as she tried to speak. "I can't leave you here," Yates continued, already shrugging off his heavy coat to wrap around her. "Come home, both of you. I've got a warm fire and food." Her eyes searched his face, desperation warring with distrust. "Name's Yates Montgomery," he offered, hoping to ease her fear. "I run cattle on the land east of town. I'm not aiming to hurt you, just want to get you and your baby somewhere safe before this blizzard hits full force." After a moment's hesitation, she gave a small nod. That was all Yates needed. With careful movements, he lifted her and the child into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed. He managed to get her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, keeping one arm securely around her waist while he guided the horse with the other. "Hold on tight to your little one," he murmured against her hair as he urged his horse forward. "We'll be home soon." The woman said nothing, but leaned back against his chest, seemingly too exhausted to maintain her wariness. The baby had quieted, soothed perhaps by the steady motion of the horse or the additional warmth. As they crested the ridge, Yates's modest ranch came into view, a sturdy two-story house with smoke curling from the chimney, a barn and a bunkhouse for the handful of men he employed. He felt the woman stiffen slightly in his arms. "Just me and 2 ranch hands," he assured her. "Mrs. Wilkins comes by to cook and clean 3 days a week, but she's home with her family now, ahead of the storm." By the time they reached the house, the snow was falling in earnest. Yates dismounted quickly and reached up for the woman and child. Her legs buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he caught her against him. "I've got you," he said, scooping her into his arms once more. He kicked at the door until one of his ranch hands, Lewis, pulled it open. "Boss, we were getting word." Lewis stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening at the sight of the woman and baby. "Dios mío." "Get a fire going in the guest room," Yates ordered as he carried the woman inside, "and find some milk for the baby if we have any." Lewis nodded and hurried to do as asked while Yates took the stairs carefully, mindful of his precious burden. The woman's eyes were closed again, her breathing shallow, and the baby had begun to fuss. The guest room was simply furnished but clean, with a large bed covered in quilts. Yates gently laid the woman down, hesitating before unwrapping the baby from her tight grip. The infant, a girl, he realized, blinked up at him with dark blue eyes, her tiny face red from cold and crying. "Hello, little miss," he murmured, awkwardly cradling her small form. "Let's get you both warmed up." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Lewis brought hot water and clean towels while Yates's other hand, Tom, rode to fetch the doctor despite the worsening weather. Yates managed to coax some warm milk into the baby using a cloth dipped in the liquid, which she sucked at hungrily. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring incoherently. Yates removed her snow-soaked boots and outer garments, replacing them with a warm flannel nightgown that had belonged to his late mother. He worked with clinical efficiency, preserving her modesty as best he could, though his cheeks burned at the intimacy of the task. By the time Dr. Patterson arrived, stomping snow from his boots in the entryway, Yates had both mother and child settled in the bed, piled with every blanket he could find. "Found them half buried in snow out by Cougar Ridge," Yates explained as the doctor examined the woman. "Baby seems all right, but she's—" He trailed off, worry evident in his voice. Dr. Patterson, a grizzled man in his 50s who had treated everything from gunshot wounds to childbirth in his years on the frontier, nodded gravely as he listened to the woman's chest with his stethoscope. "Hypothermia and exhaustion," he diagnosed. "Possibly the beginnings of pneumonia. She's young and appears strong, which is in her favor." He turned his attention to the infant. "The little one is surprisingly healthy considering. You did well getting them here when you did, Yates. Another hour in that cold." The doctor left medicines and instructions, promising to return when the weather allowed. Yates saw him to the door, then returned to the guest room where Lewis had taken up watch. "You should get some rest, boss," Lewis suggested. "I can sit with them." Yates shook his head. "I'll stay. You get on back to the bunkhouse before the snow gets worse." After Lewis left, Yates settled into a chair beside the bed. The woman's breathing had deepened, her cheeks flushed now with fever rather than cold. The baby had fallen asleep at her side, one tiny hand clutching a lock of her mother's auburn hair. Yates found himself studying the woman's face. She was young, perhaps 20 or so, with delicate features and long lashes that cast shadows on her cheeks in the lamplight. There was a strength in her face, even in repose, that spoke of someone who had endured hardship. Who was she? Where had she come from, and how had she ended up alone in a snowstorm with an infant? She wore no wedding ring, he'd noticed, though that didn't necessarily mean anything. The quality of her clothing, though worn, suggested she wasn't destitute. These questions occupied Yates's mind as he maintained his vigil through the night, occasionally rising to add wood to the fire or check the baby. Outside, the storm raged, but within the sturdy walls of the ranch house, all was quiet save for the crackling flames and soft breathing of his unexpected guests. It was near dawn when the woman stirred. Yates, who had dozed off in his chair, snapped awake at her movement. Her eyes opened, confusion giving way to alarm as she frantically felt beside her for the baby. "She's right here," Yates said quickly, gesturing to the infant sleeping peacefully at her side. "She's fine. You both are safe." The woman's relief was palpable, but wariness returned as she took in her surroundings and Yates himself. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse but carried a gentle lilt that hinted at an Eastern upbringing. "My ranch, about 10 miles east of Silver Creek. I'm Yates Montgomery, remember? Found you out in the snow yesterday." He spoke softly, trying not to frighten her. "What's your name, madam?" She hesitated, one hand protectively covering her baby. "Abigail," she finally said. "Abigail Fleming, and this is Emma. Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Fleming." Yates nodded toward the window, where snow continued to fall. "Doctor says you've got the beginnings of pneumonia. You need rest and warmth. The storm's likely to keep us all homebound for a few days anyway." Abigail tried to sit up but fell back with a grimace. "I can't impose. You're not imposing," Yates interrupted firmly. "You and little Emma are welcome here as long as needed." He stood, suddenly aware of his rumpled appearance after a night in the chair. "I'll fetch you some breakfast. Think you could manage some broth and tea?" Abigail nodded weakly, her eyes already drooping despite her obvious effort to stay alert. Yates paused at the door. "Miss Fleming, you're safe here. I give you my word." Something in his tone must have reassured her, for some of the tension left her body. As Yates headed downstairs to the kitchen, he wondered what circumstances had brought Abigail Fleming and her daughter to the brink of death in the Colorado wilderness. Little did he know, her story would change the course of his solitary existence forever. The next few days established a routine. The blizzard continued unabated, blanketing the ranch in several feet of snow and effectively cutting them off from town. Yates divided his time between caring for his livestock with Lewis and Tom and tending to Abigail and Emma. Dr. Patterson had left medicines that Yates dutifully administered, coaxing Abigail to swallow bitter-tasting tonics and applying cool cloths to her forehead when fever made her restless. The baby proved to be remarkably good-natured despite the upheaval, content to be held by Yates when Abigail was too weak to care for her. At first, he had been terrified of holding something so small and fragile. His large, work-roughened hands seemed ill-suited to the task. But necessity overcame his hesitation, and he soon found himself growing comfortable with little Emma's weight in his arms. On the fourth morning, Yates entered the guest room with a tray of breakfast to find Abigail sitting up in bed, looking markedly improved. Her hair had been combed and braided, and some color had returned to her cheeks. Emma lay beside her, kicking her tiny feet in the air. "You're looking better," Yates observed, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I feel better," Abigail replied, "thanks to your care." She hesitated, then continued, "Mr. Montgomery, I don't know how to thank you properly for what you've done for us." "Yates," he corrected, "and there's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." Abigail shook her head. "No, they wouldn't. I've learned that the hard way." Something dark crossed her features before she masked it with a small smile. "In any case, as soon as the weather clears, we'll be on our way." "On your way where?" Yates asked, then immediately regretted his bluntness. "I apologize, that's not my business." "San Francisco," Abigail answered after a moment. "I have a cousin there who's offered us a place to stay." Yates nodded, though something about her response struck him as rehearsed. "Well, you're welcome to remain here until you're fully recovered. The doctor will want to check on you again before you travel anyway." He watched as she fed Emma, her movements gentle and practiced despite her lingering weakness. When the baby was satisfied, Abigail looked up to find Yates still standing awkwardly by the door. "Would you mind holding her while I eat?" she asked. "My arms are still a bit shaky." Yates stepped forward to take the infant, settling her against his shoulder with growing confidence. Emma gurgled contentedly, her tiny hand patting his chest. "You're quite good with her," Abigail remarked, watching them with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "We've come to an understanding, haven't we, Miss Emma?" Yates said, bouncing the baby gently. "She tells me when she's hungry or needs changing, and I do my best to oblige." Abigail's laugh was unexpected and musical, lighting up her face in a way that made Yates's breath catch. "She has you wrapped around her finger already." "It doesn't take much," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "I've always had a soft spot for small creatures in need of protection." Something in Abigail's expression shifted. a vulnerability appearing briefly before she turned her attention to her breakfast. Yates continued to hold Emma, humming softly as he paced the room, giving Abigail time to eat in peace. The next week saw Abigail regaining her strength rapidly. The storm finally abated, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white stretching as far as the eye could see. Dr. Patterson made his way to the ranch as soon as the trails were passable, pronouncing himself satisfied with Abigail's recovery, but advising against immediate travel. "Another week of rest, at least," he instructed, packing away his instruments. "Your lungs need time to heal completely, especially before undertaking a journey in this cold." Abigail accepted this verdict with a resigned nod, though Yates thought he detected a hint of relief in her acquiescence. Whatever or whoever she was running from, perhaps she welcomed the delay. For his part, Yates found himself in no hurry to see his guests depart. The ranch house, which had seemed so empty since his parents' passing 3 years prior, now echoed with the sounds of life. Emma's coos and occasional cries, Abigail's soft footsteps, the gentle cadence of her voice as she sang lullabies, these had all become part of the rhythm of his days. As Abigail grew stronger, she insisted on contributing to the household. Yates returned from checking cattle one afternoon to find her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up as she kneaded bread dough. "You shouldn't be exerting yourself," he admonished gently, hanging his coat by the door. "I've been resting for over a week," she countered. "Besides, I want to earn my keep. I noticed your pantry was getting low on bread, and baking is something I can manage." Yates wanted to tell her she didn't need to earn her keep, that her presence alone was payment enough for any inconvenience, but he sensed her need for independence and merely nodded. "Lewis will be pleased. He's been complaining about my cooking since Mrs. Wilkins hasn't been able to make it out here." "Where did you learn to cook?" Abigail asked, shaping the dough into loaves. "My mother taught me the basics before she passed, enough to keep from starving, but nothing fancy." He leaned against the counter, watching her capable hands. "You clearly know what you're doing." "I worked as a cook's assistant at a hotel in Denver for a while," she said, her focus on her task. "Before Emma." It was the first personal detail she had volunteered about her life before he found her, and Yates treaded carefully. "Denver's a growing place. Must have been interesting work." "It was," she agreed. "I met all manner of people passing through." Her tone remained light, but he noticed her hands had stilled on the dough, sensing her discomfort. Yates changed the subject. "I need to ride into town tomorrow for supplies. Is there anything particular you or Emma need?" Gratitude flickered in her eyes. "Some cloth for diapers would be helpful. And perhaps, do you think there might be a book I could borrow? The days grow long when confined indoors." "I'll see what I can find," Yates promised. "There's a small lending library at the church. Anything specific you enjoy reading? Anything at all," she said with a small smile. "I've always found escape in books." The next day, Yates returned from town with not only the requested items but also a wooden rattle for Emma and a knitted shawl in soft blue wool for Abigail. When she protested the gifts, he shrugged off her concerns. "Consider them belated Christmas presents," he said. "The holiday passed while you were ill." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Abigail joined Yates in the sitting room. He had built up the fire to ward off the persistent chill, and the warm glow illuminated the small space. Abigail settled into an armchair, wrapping the new shawl around her shoulders. "Thank you for the books," she said, gesturing to the small stack he had procured. "It's been too long since I've had the luxury of reading." Yates, who had been mending a bridle, set his work aside. "My mother was a great reader. Those are from her collection." He nodded toward the bookshelf in the corner. "She would have been pleased to see them being enjoyed again." "Tell me about her," Abigail requested softly, "about your family." So Yates found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about his parents who had established the ranch in the early days of the territory, about his childhood helping with cattle and learning the land. He spoke of his father's death from a fall from a horse when Yates was 20, and his mother's decline thereafter, passing 2 years later. "I'm sorry," Abigail said when he finished. "It must be lonely, carrying on alone." Yates hadn't thought of it as loneliness until recently. It was simply his life. But now, looking at Abigail's compassionate face across the warmth of the fire, he recognized the emptiness that had become his constant companion. "It's the way of things out here," he said with a shrug. "Men live and die by their own hands. That sounds like a terribly solitary existence." "It can be," he admitted, "but there's peace in it too. The land doesn't ask questions or make demands. It simply is." Abigail's gaze was thoughtful. "Yet you didn't hesitate to burden yourself with a sick woman and her baby." "That wasn't a burden," Yates said firmly. "That was being human." They fell into comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional soft thud of settling logs in the wood stove. Yates found himself studying Abigail's profile, the way the firelight caught in her auburn hair and illuminated the curve of her cheek. He quickly looked away when she turned toward him. "Your turn," he said, clearing his throat. "Fair's fair." Abigail tensed visibly. "My story isn't as straightforward as yours." "Most aren't," Yates replied, "but I'm not one to judge." She was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I grew up in Boston. My father was a merchant who lost everything in the Panic of '73. He took his own life." She twisted her hands in her lap. "My mother had died years before, so I was alone. I came west on the promise of work as a governess for a family in Denver. But that didn't work out." Yates prompted gently when she paused. "No." Her smile was bitter. "The position had already been filled. I took work where I could find at shops, laundries, finally the hotel kitchen." She hesitated. "That's where I met Emma's father." Yates kept his expression neutral, though his hands clenched involuntarily. He was passing through on business. Well-dressed, well-spoken. He said he was a widower with mining interests in Nevada. She looked down at her hands. "I was young and naive. He promised marriage, a home, stability. When he left, he said he would send for me once he had preparations made." "But he didn't," Yates guessed, anger stirring on her behalf. "No, months passed. Then I discovered I was expecting Emma." Abigail's voice grew stronger. "I wrote to the address he had given me. The letter came back marked no such person. I later learned he was already married with a family in St. Louis." "So you decided to head to San Francisco?" Yates asked, remembering her earlier mention of a cousin there. Abigail hesitated, then shook her head. "There is no cousin in San Francisco." I was desperate. The hotel dismissed me when my condition became apparent. I took what work I could, but after Emma was born." She took a deep breath. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from him. Somehow he had discovered my whereabouts and that I had borne his child. He wrote that he was coming to Denver, that he would resolve the situation." Fear crept into her voice. The way he phrased it, I was afraid he meant to take Emma from me, or worse. "So you ran," Yates said softly. Abigail nodded. "With what little money I had saved. I thought I could make it to Pueblo, perhaps find work there. But the stagecoach was delayed by weather, and when we finally departed Denver, we barely made it halfway before breaking an axle. The other passengers were taken in by a nearby ranch, but I overheard 2 men talking. They described a man asking about a woman traveling with an infant, a man fitting his description." Her hands were trembling now. "I slipped away during the night. I thought I could walk to the next town. Then the snow began. "And I found you," Yates finished for her. "Yes." She looked up at him, her green eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Now you know why I can't stay. If he's searching for us, I've put you at risk by being here." Yates leaned forward, his expression intent. "Abigail, no man has the right to terrorize you or take your child. The law would be on your side." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "The law favors men with money and influence, which he has in abundance. I have nothing but my word against his." "You have more than that now," Yates said firmly. "You have me." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Yates. Despite her revelations and expressed intention to leave, Abigail seemed in no hurry to depart. January gave way to February, and the bitter cold began to moderate slightly. Abigail's strength returned fully, and she took on more household tasks, her capable hands bringing order to rooms that had seen only bachelor care for too long. Emma thrived under the combined attention of her mother and Yates, who found endless fascination in her developing personality. Her first proper smile directed at him as he sang a silly cattle song nearly stopped his heart with its perfection. "She likes your voice," Abigail observed, watching them from the doorway. "Poor judgment on her part," Yates replied with a self-deprecating grin. "My mother always said I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." "Mothers aren't always right about everything," Abigail said, her smile holding a warmth that made his chest tighten. They fell into domestic rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Mornings began with Yates tending to ranch chores while Abigail prepared breakfast. Evenings often found them in the sitting room, Yates working on ledgers or mending tack while Abigail sewed or read aloud from one of his mother's books, Emma sleeping contentedly nearby. It was during one such evening that Yates realized how completely this woman and child had infiltrated his heart. Abigail was reading from The Last of the Mohicans, her voice rising and falling with the drama of the narrative. The lamplight caught the rich auburn highlights in her hair, and occasionally she would glance up from the page to see if he was still engaged, her smile warm when she caught his eye. This, he thought with sudden clarity, was what he wanted every day for the rest of his life. The realization terrified him. Abigail had made no secret of her intention to leave, even if she seemed in no hurry to do so. She had been deceived by a man once before. Why would she trust another, especially one as rough-hewn and ordinary as himself? Yet as February progressed, Yates found himself searching for signs that perhaps she felt something beyond gratitude. The way her hand lingered when passing him a cup of coffee, how she laughed at his dry humor when he recounted the antics of a particularly stubborn calf. The fact that she no longer spoke of leaving. One afternoon, he returned from town to find Abigail on the porch, bundled against the cold but clearly enjoying the sunshine. Emma was asleep indoors, giving her mother a rare moment of solitude. "You're back earlier than expected," she greeted him with a smile that warmed him more than any fire could. "Roads are clearing," he said, climbing the steps to join her. "Spring's coming." "Yes," she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. "I noticed the first buds on the willows by the creek yesterday." Yates leaned against the porch railing, gathering his courage. "Abigail, there's something I need to ask you." She turned to him, her expression guarded. "Yes." "With spring coming, I know you'll be thinking about moving on," he began awkwardly. "But I was hoping, that is, I wanted to suggest." He took a deep breath. "Stay here with me." Abigail's eyes widened. "Yates, not out of obligation," he hurried to add. "And not just because of Emma, though heaven knows I've grown to love that child like she was my own." His voice softened. "It's you, Abigail. These past weeks with you have shown me what I was missing. What this house was missing. Life. Laughter. Someone to share the good days and the hard ones." You barely know me, she whispered, though he noticed she hadn't moved away. I know enough, he countered. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you're willing to sacrifice everything for your daughter. I know the sound of your laughter makes my day brighter, and the thought of you leaving makes it hard to breathe. He took a step toward her, close enough now to see the rapid pulse at her throat. I'm not offering out of pity or duty. I'm offering because I've fallen in love with you, Abigail Fleming. Tears welled in her eyes. Oh, Yates, I can't ask you to take on my burdens. Emma's father is not a concern, Yates said firmly. No man with any decency would try to separate a child from her mother. And if he lacks decency, then he'll find himself facing more than he bargained for if he comes here. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. I'm not asking for an answer today. Just think about it. This could be your home, yours and Emma's, for as long as you want it to be. Abigail looked up at him, tears spilling onto her cheeks. You don't understand what you're offering. The risk is mine to take, Yates finished for her, and I'd take far greater risks to keep you both safe and happy. She studied his face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I'll think about it. It was all he could ask for. March brought the first true signs of spring to the ranch. The snow receded, revealing patches of muddy earth that would soon give way to green grass and wildflowers. Yates was busier than ever, preparing for calving season and repairing winter damage to fences and outbuildings. Despite the increased workload, he made sure to spend time with Abigail and Emma each day. Abigail had not given him an answer to his proposal, but neither had she made any move to leave. If anything, she seemed to be putting down roots. She had started a small kitchen garden, planting seeds in shallow boxes to be transplanted when the danger of frost passed. She took over the household accounts, displaying a head for figures that impressed Yates. And she began accompanying him on short rides around the property. Emma bundled securely between them, learning the contours of the land with evident interest. On one such ride, they stopped atop a gentle rise that overlooked the ranch buildings and the creek that bisected the property. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs, a welcome change from the winter chill. It's beautiful, Abigail said, taking in the vista. You can see why your parents chose this place. Yates nodded, watching her rather than the view. My father always said a man should be able to see what's his from a single vantage point, not out of pride, but to know what he's responsible for. A wise perspective, she murmured, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby was awake, her eyes wide as she took in the open sky and gentle breeze. I've been thinking, Yates said carefully, about what you told me about Emma's father. Abigail tensed beside him. If he truly means to find you, sitting and waiting won't solve anything, he continued. We should take action. What kind of action? She asked, her voice strained. Make it official. You and Emma here. He turned to face her fully. Marry me, Abigail. Let me give Emma my name, make her legally mine. No court would side with him then, especially given the circumstances. Abigail's lips parted in surprise. Yates, I can't let you do that. Marriage is sacred, not a legal maneuver. It wouldn't be just that, he said earnestly. I meant what I said before. I love you, Abigail. I love Emma. I want us to be a family, not just for protection, but because it's what I desire more than anything. She looked down at Emma, then back at him, conflict evident in her expression. And if he never comes looking, if years pass and we hear nothing, then we'll have years of happiness, Yates said simply. What's the downside to that? A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. You make it sound so straightforward. Some things are, he replied. Do you care for me, Abigail? Even a little, her eyes softened as she looked at him. More than a little, Yates Montgomery, much more. Hope surged in his chest, then the rest is just details. Abigail shifted Emma to one arm and reached out to touch his cheek with her free hand. You deserve someone without complications, without a past. Everyone has a past, Yates countered, covering her hand with his own. It's the future I'm interested in. Their gazes held for a long moment, and Yates found himself leaning forward, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity. Abigail didn't pull away. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. When they parted, Abigail's cheeks were flushed and Yates felt lightheaded with joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes," he repeated, hardly daring to believe. "Yes, I'll marry you." Her smile was radiant despite the tears in her eyes. For all the right reasons, not just the practical ones. Yates wanted to whoop with joy, to lift her and Emma into his arms and spin them around. Instead, he settled for another kiss, this one deeper and filled with promise. "We should go back," Abigail said after a moment, her voice breathless. "Emma will be getting hungry soon." Yates helped her back onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist. As they rode back toward the ranch house, their home, he felt a sense of rightness that had been missing for too long. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Silver Creek. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Lewis and Tom, Dr. Patterson and his wife, Mrs. Wilkins and her family, and a handful of neighboring ranchers. Abigail wore a dress of pale blue muslin that Mrs. Wilkins had helped her alter from one found in a trunk in the attic. Emma, now nearly 5 months old, wore a christening gown that had once been Yates's. Pastor Williams pronounced them man and wife with evident pleasure, and the small gathering celebrated with a modest feast back at the ranch. It wasn't until the last guest had departed, and Emma was asleep in her cradle, that Yates and Abigail found themselves truly alone as husband and wife. Standing in the bedroom that had been his parents' and was now theirs, Yates felt a sudden attack of nerves. Abigail seemed equally uncertain, her hands fidgeting with the ribbon at her waist. "We don't have to. That is, if you need more time," Yates began awkwardly. Abigail shook her head, a shy smile curving her lips. "I don't need more time. I just need you to know that I've never with anyone except—" "Oh," Yates said, understanding dawning. "Abigail, we have a lifetime. There's no rush for anything." She stepped closer to him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I want to be a true wife to you, Yates, in every way." He gathered her hands in his. "You already are. The rest will come naturally." And it did. Their union that night was tender and discovering, each learning the other with gentle hands and whispered words of love. As they lay entwined afterward, Abigail's head resting on his chest, Yates felt a contentment so deep it bordered on reverence. "Thank you," Abigail murmured sleepily. "For what?" Yates asked, stroking her hair. "For finding us in the snow, for bringing us home." Yates tightened his arms around her. "Best decision I ever made." Spring blossomed into full glory across the ranch. The cattle were fat on new grass. The calving season had been successful with minimal losses, and the garden Abigail had started was flourishing. Emma was growing too, sitting up now and babbling happily, especially when Yates would carry her out to see the animals. Life settled into pleasant rhythms punctuated by moments of joy. Emma's first tooth, the first time she reached for Yates with a definite "da." That reduced him to emotional silence. The quiet evenings when he and Abigail would sit on the porch watching the sunset after Emma was asleep. It was on one such evening in late May that they saw the rider approaching from the direction of town. Yates felt Abigail stiffen beside him before he even registered the unusual hour for a visitor. "Probably just Lewis back from his day off," Yates said, though something in him was already alert, wary. As the rider drew closer, it became apparent it wasn't Lewis. The horse was too fine, the rider's clothes too formal for the frontier setting. Yates stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll see what he wants." But Abigail stood as well, her hand gripping his arm. "No," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I know who it is." The rider reined in his horse at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at them with an expression of calculated charm that immediately set Yates's teeth on edge. He was a handsome man in his 30s, well dressed in a suit that had seen better days but still spoke of wealth. His eyes, cold despite his smile, fixed on Abigail. "Abigail," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I've been looking everywhere for you, my dear." Yates felt her tremble beside him but admired the steadiness of her voice when she replied, "Hello, Victor. You're wasting your time here." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Now, is that any way to greet the father of your child? I've come a long way to see you both." His gaze shifted to Yates. "And who might this be?" "Yates Montgomery," Yates said, his tone deliberately neutral. "Abigail's husband." That seemed to genuinely surprise Victor, his composure slipping momentarily. "Husband, how? Enterprising of you, Abigail, replacing me so quickly." "There was nothing to replace," Abigail said coldly. "You were never anything to me but a liar." Victor dismounted, ignoring Yates's warning stance. "Such harsh words. May I come in? I've had a long journey and I believe we have much to discuss regarding our daughter." "She's not your daughter," Yates said, his voice hardening. "Not legally, not morally. You abandoned them both." "Did she tell you that?" Victor laughed, the sound brittle. "Abigail has always had a flair for the dramatic. I was simply delayed in my return. Business complications, you understand." "What I understand," Yates said, stepping down to ground level to face Victor directly, "is that you're trespassing on my property and upsetting my wife. State your business and be on your way." Victor's pleasant facade slipped further. "My business is with Abigail and my daughter. I have rights." "You have nothing," Abigail interrupted, coming to stand beside Yates. "Emma is legally Yates's daughter now. We have the papers to prove it." The adoption was finalized the day we married. It was a bluff they had begun the process, but it was not yet complete, but Victor had no way of knowing that. Doubt flickered across his face. "I don't believe you," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "It doesn't matter what you believe," Yates said evenly. "What matters is that you're not welcome here. Abigail doesn't want to see you, Emma doesn't know you, and I won't have you disturbing our family." Victor's expression darkened. "I could challenge this in court. I have resources, connections." "So do I," Yates replied, though in truth his resources were modest. "You really want your affairs aired publicly, your existing marriage examined. The fact that you abandoned a woman carrying your child, that struck home." Victor's face paled slightly. "How did you find us anyway?" Abigail asked, curiosity overcoming her fear. "It wasn't difficult," Victor said with a shrug. "Denver is a small community in its way. People talk. When I heard about a woman with a baby caught in a snowstorm, rescued by a rancher east of Silver Creek, well, it seemed worth investigating." Yates stepped closer to Victor, his voice dropping to ensure only the other man could hear him. "Listen carefully. You're going to get back on that horse and ride away. You're going to forget about Abigail and Emma. Because if you don't, I promise you'll regret it." There was no bluster in his tone, just a quiet certainty that seemed to penetrate Victor's arrogance. The man looked from Yates to Abigail, then back again. "Keep her," he finally said with a dismissive wave. "The child, too. They're more trouble than they are worth." He mounted his horse with exaggerated grace, as if attempting to maintain some dignity. "Goodbye, Abigail. I wish you joy of your rancher." With that, he turned his horse and rode back toward town, his rigid posture the only indication of his anger. Abigail sagged against Yates as soon as Victor was out of sight. "Do you think he'll come back?" she whispered. Yates held her close, watching the distant figure grow smaller. "No," he said with quiet certainty. "Men like that are cowards at heart. He wanted easy prey, not a fight." "How can you be sure?" "Because I saw his face when I confronted him. He's not willing to risk his reputation or endure public scrutiny." Yates pressed a kiss to her hair. "Besides, he's clearly the type who moves on when things get difficult. He's probably already thinking about his next conquest." Abigail nodded against his chest, though he could feel her still trembling. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Not for myself, but for Emma, for you." "It's over now," Yates assured her, guiding her back to the porch. "He's gone and we're together, that's all that matters." That night, after checking twice that all doors were locked, Yates held Abigail until her breathing evened out in sleep. Only then did he allow himself to acknowledge how close they had come to losing everything. Victor might have had legal rights to Emma, might have been able to take her from them despite the adoption proceedings they had begun. But something in the man's easy capitulation suggested he had never truly wanted the child, only the power to disrupt Abigail's life. Such men were dangerous in their own way, but they were also predictable. Victor had cut his losses when confronted with determined opposition. Still, Yates resolved to expedite the adoption paperwork first thing in the morning. He wouldn't rest easy until Emma was legally his in every way that mattered. Summer arrived in a blaze of wildflowers and long, golden evenings. Emma learned to crawl, pursuing the ranch cats with delighted determination and keeping Abigail constantly vigilant. The garden yielded vegetables in abundance, and Abigail spent hours preserving the bounty for the winter months ahead. There had been no further sign of Victor, and as the weeks passed, the tension in Abigail's shoulders gradually eased. The adoption was finalized in July, making official what they already knew in their hearts, that Emma was a Montgomery through and through. One sultry August evening, as they sat on a blanket near the creek watching Emma play with smooth stones Yates had collected for her, Abigail turned to him with an expression that made his heart skip. "I have something to tell you," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "Something good, I hope," Yates replied, reaching for her hand. "Very good." She placed his palm against her still flat stomach. "Emma's going to have a brother or sister come spring." Joy coursed through him, so intense he couldn't speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "Truly?" Abigail nodded, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Dr. Patterson confirmed it yesterday when you were out with the herd. Are you pleased?" In answer, Yates gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the love that overflowed his heart. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," he said when they parted. There aren't words, Abigail." Emma crawled over to investigate their embrace, babbling her own commentary. Yates lifted her into their circle, holding his family close as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. "A year ago I thought I knew what my life would be," he said reflectively. "Seasons of work, watching the land and the cattle, growing old alone. And now?" Abigail prompted, her head resting on his shoulder. "Now I know better," Yates said simply. "Now I know that finding you and Emma was just the beginning, that every day brings new joys I never imagined possible, even the difficult days." She asked with a gentle tease in her voice, clearly thinking of Emma's recent bout of teething that had left them all exhausted. "Even those," he confirmed, "because there are days together." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky, Yates Montgomery looked at his wife and daughter, thought of the new life growing within Abigail, and knew with absolute certainty that he was the richest man in Colorado territory. Not in gold or cattle or land, but in love, the only wealth that truly mattered. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising to the Montgomery ranch. The spring after Yates and Abigail's first anniversary welcomed not one but two new additions to their family, twin boys they named James and Thomas, after Yates's father and his loyal ranch hand, who had helped save Abigail and Emma. The twins were robust and lively from the start, keeping Abigail busy from dawn till dusk. Emma, now a toddler with her mother's auburn curls and a determined spirit, appointed herself their guardian, solemnly explaining ranch operations to her baby brothers who could do little more than gurgle in response. Yates found himself marveling daily at how completely his life had transformed. The ranch house, once so quiet and empty, now echoed with children's laughter and the constant hum of family life. He expanded the building, adding rooms to accommodate their growing numbers and making improvements. Abigail had suggested a larger kitchen with a pump indoors, better windows to capture the mountain light, a covered porch that wrapped around three sides of the house. The cattle operation thrived as well. With Abigail's head for figures and Yates's knowledge of the land, they made wise investments, purchasing additional acreage when a neighboring rancher decided to move back east. They hired more hands, built a larger bunkhouse, and established the Montgomery brand as one of the most respected in the territory. Through it all, the bond between Yates and Abigail deepened in ways neither could have anticipated. The passionate love of their early days matured into something even more powerful, a partnership of equals, each supporting the other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. They faced hardships together: drought years when the grass grew sparse, winters harsh enough to threaten the herd, the inevitable illnesses and accidents that were part of frontier life. Emma grew into a beautiful young girl with her mother's grace and intelligence, and a quiet confidence that Yates liked to think came partly from his influence. She showed an early aptitude for reading and numbers, devouring the books Yates brought back from his increasingly frequent trips to Denver. By the age of 8, she was helping with the ranch accounts, her neat figures filling the ledger books with precocious precision. The twins, identical in appearance but opposite in temperament, became Yates's shadows when they were old enough to follow him around the ranch. James was thoughtful and methodical, while Thomas was all impulse and adventure. Together they were a formidable team, learning the cattle business from the ground up just as Yates had done at their age. When Emma was 10 and the twins 6, Abigail gave birth to their fourth child, a daughter they named Sarah, after Abigail's mother. She was a sunny child from the start, with Yates's dark hair and the green eyes that had captivated him the first time Abigail had opened them in his guest room so many years before. As the children grew, so did the community around them. Silver Creek expanded from a dusty outpost to a proper town with a school, several churches and businesses catering to the needs of the growing population. Abigail, with her Eastern education and natural leadership, found herself increasingly involved in town affairs, particularly the establishment of a proper school. "Every child deserves the chance to learn," she told Yates one evening as they discussed the school board's latest plans. Not just reading and figures, but history, science, literature, all the things that open the mind to possibilities. Yates smiled at her passion. "You should teach there yourself," he suggested. "You're already doing it at home." The idea took root, and by the following year, Abigail was dividing her time between the ranch and 2 days a week at the Silver Creek School, teaching the older children while Emma, now 12, helped mind Sarah and keep the household running on those days. Life settled into seasons of work and celebration, the rhythm of the ranch dictating much of their activity. Spring brought calving and planting, Summer was for growing and building, autumn for harvest and selling cattle, winter for repairs and family time around the hearth. Through it all, Yates and Abigail's love remained the cornerstone of their existence, a quiet certainty that sustained them through every challenge. There had been no further sign of Victor over the years, though occasionally Abigail would receive news from Denver acquaintances that mentioned him in passing. He had apparently returned to St. Louis permanently, his Colorado ventures having proved less profitable than expected. Yates noticed that Abigail no longer tensed at the mere mention of his name, time, and security, had healed those wounds. On the 15th anniversary of the day Yates had found Abigail and Emma in the snow, the family gathered for a special dinner to celebrate what they had come to call their finding day. It had become a tradition over the years, as important to them as Christmas or birthdays. The dining table, expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, was laden with Abigail's best cooking roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a special cake decorated with dried berries preserved from the summer harvest. "I propose a toast," Yates said, raising his glass. At 52, his hair was now more silver than brown, lines of laughter and sun etched around his eyes, but his back was still straight, his hands still strong. "To finding what you didn't know you were looking for. To coming home," Abigail added, her beauty only enhanced by the passing years. At 41, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that drew all eyes whenever she entered a room. "Both of us." Emma, now a lovely young woman of 20, smiled at her parents with understanding beyond her years. She knew the full story now, of how she and her mother had come to the ranch, of the man who had abandoned them and the one who had claimed them as his own. "To family," she offered, raising her own glass. "Chosen and made." The twins, gangly 16-year-olds on the cusp of manhood, added their glasses to the toast with typical enthusiasm. Even 10-year-old Sarah, allowed a special cup of watered cider for the occasion, joined in solemnly. As Yates looked around the table at the family he and Abigail had built, he felt a fullness in his heart that defied description. From that desperate moment in the snow when he'd found a half-frozen woman clutching her baby, to this warm gathering of beloved faces, it was a journey he could never have imagined but would never trade for any other path. Later that night, when the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Yates and Abigail stood on the porch under a canopy of stars. The winter air was crisp, but not bitter, and Yates wrapped a blanket around them both as they gazed out at the land that had sustained them. "Any regrets?" Yates asked softly, his arm around her waist. Abigail leaned into him, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin as it always had. "Not one," she said with quiet certainty. "Every step, every choice led us here, even the painful ones. Even getting caught in that blizzard," he teased gently. "Especially that," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "That storm brought me to you, brought us home." Yates kissed her then, as tenderly as he had on their wedding day, marveling that after all these years, his love for this woman had only grown deeper, richer, more essential to his very being. "Come inside," Abigail whispered against his lips. "It's getting cold." Hand in hand, they walked back into the house they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the home it had become, filled with love and memories and the promise of more to come. And as Yates closed the door behind them, shutting out the winter night, he said a silent prayer of gratitude for that fateful day when he had found a woman and her child in the snow, and had the wisdom to say the words that changed all their lives. "Come home, both of you."